I'll just see if this is on here. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Philippa Chapman. Nice to see so many people here today. I'm the director of the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities. And we've had a long and interesting, not collaboration, what's the word, series of discussions with the Productivity Commission, whose work we highly value. And we thought today we would take as our topic their Better Urban Planning, which is a very important report that Jeff Lewis led in the Productivity Commission. And we've got 3 speakers today. Unfortunately, one of the speakers was unable to come. I'll introduce them first, and then they'll follow in sequence. So each of them will have 10 minutes, and then we will have half an hour for discussion. So I'll do them in the order in which they appear. Sylvia Allen, pleased to see you on the panel, is an experienced town planner with a background in environmental science. She's a former president and fellow of the New Zealand Planning Institute, holder of the Institute's Distinguished Service Award and the first Nancy Norcroft Planning Practice Award. She was formerly technical planning lead for one of New Zealand's multidisciplinary engineering companies and now operates her own business as a business consultant, providing advice and assistance to central government agencies, district and regional councils, ... She has also had a very long involvement in community and planning issues in and around Wellington and further afield. She will be followed by Roger next, isn't it? Rafe next. He's an associate professor and an economist up at Victoria University, and he's worked in government, the private sector and academia. He's director of the graduate program in environmental studies at Victoria and is a researcher on climate change issues, researcher and protester. Rafe is co-director of the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Cities, where his work focuses on urban form and implications for carbon emissions. He has become interested in practical ways of doing something about climate change, that is, mitigation policies in transport, energy, housing and cities. And our last speaker, we usually have that somebody from one of the councils actually speaks and to the issues. Roger Blakeley, who will be known to all of you, is an elected member of the Greater Wellington Regional Council, congratulations, and Capital and Coast District Health Board. He was Chief Planning Officer, Auckland Council, from the start of the governance reforms from 2010 to 2015. He led the development of the 30-year planning documents for Auckland, the Auckland Plan, Economic Development Strategy, City Centre Master Plan, and Auckland Unitary Plan. Other positions that he has held include Chief Executive of Pororoa City Council, Chief Executive Department of Internal Affairs, Chief Secretary Ministry for the Environment, and the last one snuck away as the General Manager for the State Coal Mines. Okay, so Sylvia, would you like to start us off?
Kia ora everyone, it's good to see a room full of people and many familiar faces. So I'd just like to make a few points before I get into my slides, and I'm going to move really quickly. First of all, I should say I'm delighted with the report, not because I think it's wonderful or anything, but because it's raised many, many issues and it's fleshing a lot of things out. I do agree with a lot of it, and I don't agree with a lot of it. I think a few things we need to remember: the planning system is a framework, it doesn't provide blueprints, so it's very much underpinning things that actually go on in the real world. The current RMA is a dog and it needs review anyway, so I'm pleased to see that. Most of our urban environment is already with us, so that's really important to remember. We're not building new suburbs all the time. And finally, we're a small country. We're half the size of London in population, but we're a lot more spread out. So we shouldn't be trying to reinvent the wheel all the time. So this is reflections. And where have we come from? That was my first thought. I've been in this field for 45 years or more. Pre-RMA times, it was definitely simpler times. We had standardised zoning. We had limited rights of input from the community. But the system, by and large, delivered. The downsides of pre-RMA time was that the urban quality we got was not great. There was a lot of sprawl. The community paid for services and infrastructure rather than development paying for it itself, and there was a feeling that all development was good development regardless of its quality or where it actually was. But how did things work in pre-MA times? There was actually an active development community, and that community led development. It was kind of run and helped by surveyors and land developers, and they had the ear of councils, and development was their business. There was little or no land banking. There were very conservative forms of development, the standard model that's actually still with us, 3-bedroom houses on individual sections, and it is with us, except that now the houses are bigger and probably less versatile than they were. And really important, the bottom point there, central government and councils filled the gap in social housing, and they also tried out new housing models. So multi-unit development and things, that was all led by councils and government. The private sector never really did that. The reforms that led to the RMA, it was very much Rogernomics. 1987 to 1991 was the development phase of the RMA. There was a huge anti-planning emphasis in our society. No picking winners, and plans had to provide a level playing field. Importantly, 54 statutes rolled into one, management of everything through controlling effects, and yet that system also delivered us much more extensive community and individual rights than we had before. And this is my observation, being right in the centre of RMA reforms. Urban planning was a subversive activity within the new framework of the RMA. There was no real mandate at all for urban planning. Nevertheless, urban councils kept doing it despite the challenges and a really unfriendly operating environment for planning. And I pick out Napier City Council, for example, which saw that its population was going backwards and decided to actually do some active urban planning. And it managed to turn things round. Regional councils fought to be allowed to do it, and there's case law that actually said that regional councils can't do urban planning. But again, some of the councils kept on doing it, and Auckland and Canterbury I would pick out as two regional councils that tried to get on top of urban requirements. But it was hard, and it's still hard, and despite initiatives from the Ministry for the Environment and things, it's still hard. Now, do we need a new planning system? And there's a lot more bullet points here. Probably not, but we certainly need to develop and adapt what we've got. What worries me about the suggestions of throwing out everything is that we do have an integrated system. We need to avoid barriers and boundaries between responsibilities. We think we need to recognise planning as a good thing, not a bad thing, and I think that's fairly clearly stated in the report. We need to recognise environmental constraints as a framework for urban development opportunities. We don't ignore them. We need to create, but more importantly, seize the opportunities. And the planning system, as I said, is not a blueprint, it's a framework. Really importantly, we need to resolve the dilemma between control and quality. It really worries me that we lose quality when we take the kind of control brakes off. But there must be ways of achieving quality. I think back to the sausage blocks of the 1960s as what happens when you take control off. Reduce statutory interpretation issues and the right to appeal. I think that's really important, and the sorts of models that I actually appreciate more than the Environment Court is the British Planning Inspectorate, which is just more a planning body, and the lawyers have a lot less to do with that there. Allow for opportunities to take land where it is a block on development, and that's not a popular idea, but I think it's an important idea. We can talk about that later perhaps. And some rolling funding, and I'm sure Roger's got ideas on this, to get ahead in terms of community facilities and create attractive areas before we actually build, before we start building. And part of my experience was working in Milton Keynes, Newtown in the UK in its early days, and every development there had at least a 7-year lead time before people were able to move into houses. And that was on top of a huge urban framework, infrastructure framework, that was probably about 10 years ahead of development. Then just thinking about what sort of planners for the future, because there's a lot of criticism of the planning profession in the report. I think planners in the future have to be visionaries. They have to be they need to work in multi-capable teams. Planners now, I think the last 2 or almost 3 decades of training has been effects management. We need to be much more positive. They need to have more mandate within local authorities to drive and encourage development. They need to be working in a much more friendly national, regional, local partnership framework. They need to have recognised status. You need to be able to hold your head up and say proudly you're a planner, not oh, I'm a planner, and people say, what's that? And I think people need to refocus from the control, which is a desperate position, just handling applications, to actually be a bit more creative. Now, one thing that's kind of behind the report is the idea of urban development authorities, and I just thought I'd let you know. I think they're necessary and good ideas. They're more important for redevelopment than for new development. But we shouldn't be having a multiplicity of urban development authorities. I think we need a nationwide skilled pool to service local demand, not to take over, but to work with urban development authorities at local level. And finally, what really needs fixing, not just the planning system, a whole lot more. I think we need better national information thinking and leadership, as we used to have at the Planning Council, for instance. We need national practical capacity building and assistance, such as the old Ministry of Works. We need to deal somehow with land banking and to promote orderly development. I don't think the report has actually dealt with that. We need to extend the development industry capacity and capability, and we need better building industry capacity and capability. And they're all things for the future. So, stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sylvia. That was a very interesting overview, and I'll pass over to Ralph Chapman.
Tēnā koutou. So, hold on, let me get my thing up. That one. Okay. Maybe I went a bit past this machine. Okay, stable. So I come at this from a somewhat different point of view. I hope complementary to Sylvia's and to Roger's. My background is as an economist, but I've also worked on environmental issues for a long time. So with a sustainable development orientation, trying to think more broadly about how economic incentives fit with incentives to maintain our environment and protect our ecosystems. So to note the question mark, better urban planning. 4 key comments. It's a valuable report. I see Jeff Lewis here from the Productivity Commission, and nice to see you, Jeff. I think it's got lots of really good reading and thinking and argumentation in the report, so it's worth a look. It is a little long, I have to say. It's a watch if you've tried to get through it. So, take your time, but go through it and think about the issues. I think it's really a good debate. And I agree with much that's in it, including, for example, the need for environmental limits, quite clear about that. But I think it's fundamentally a laissez-faire view of planning and the role of planning, and I think it would lead to detrimental outcomes in terms of more urban sprawl. We've already got urban sprawl in this country, and we've got a model of urban expansion rather than intensification, which I think has real problems from a sustainability point of view. So that was my main concern. I disagree to some extent, not fully, but to some extent I disagree on housing price drivers. The Productivity Commission recommendations would drive infrastructure with higher costs, in my view, because it would lead to more greenfields development, which is costly. There's no doubt about that. And wouldn't necessarily tackle the current intensification barriers, although I'm a bit equivocal on that, because I think there are sensible things in the report which would help deal with some barriers to intensification, but I think more could be done in that area. And lastly, I disagree on the climate change contribution that planning and local regulation can make. The Productivity Commission is pretty sceptical about that. I think cities can and must make a significant contribution to cutting carbon emissions, and that's urgent and vital. So just to elaborate a little bit more on these points, there are lots of valid observations on the RMA and its imperfect nature. I'm actually a believer that you cannot have a perfect planning statute around cities and the environment. The perfect is probably the enemy of the good. Reforming constantly is problematic because you throw out a whole lot of case law. There's an optimum in there somewhere which lives with imperfection but tries to improve. But the RMA, does at the moment, I think, focus too much on the negatives rather than urban positives. It's not really a statute focused on the urban environment. F5.3, by the way, is finding 5.3. If you know the report, you know there's a bunch of findings and a bunch of recommendations, Fs and Rs. Some good points in the report about providing and funding infrastructure, and especially things like value capture, which I think we've done too little of in New Zealand. Have a look at section 15.1, especially the last few bullets, if you get around to it. Other good ideas, I should have mentioned urban development authorities. Of course, they already exist, and they're being planned in the case of Wellington. But I think they have an important role. But I also wanted to support the idea of regional spatial plans, which is giving more of a boost to regional spatial planning and giving it a statutory function as opposed to the way it sits now outside the RMA hierarchy. And I agree that there's a need for better outcome monitoring. We don't do enough of that. The government's not very well informed about what's going on, the limitations of achieving good environmental outcomes and so on, and not just environmental outcomes. But I think it's fundamentally, if you look for the philosophy underneath this report, it's fundamentally a laissez-faire one. Now, I'm not necessarily against laissez-faire. I think there's a role for laissez-faire in some areas. But I think our cities and our environment are too important for laissez-faire, basically. Laissez-faire, just let it happen, let the market go, That's not where I think we should be going. The report is essentially opposed to pushing for more compact cities. It's got a philosophical problem with pushing in that direction. But my question is, given what we know about problems with expanding, sprawling cities, and we only need to look around the world and see, for example, Dallas or Houston or Atlanta sprawling away with massive carbon emissions and massive quality of life issues, highways everywhere, dominance of parking, and so on and so on. And compare that with more planned cities where they're more sustainable, better choice of transport systems and so on. I think it's legitimate to push in the direction of more planned, more compact cities. There are many reasons, and they're not just around carbon emissions, why there are sustainability benefits. Things like water quality. A lot of traffic, a lot of roads leads to poor water quality. There's a clear correlation there. And compactness historically has been undermined by a whole lot of forces like free highway construction. Expensive highway construction, but free at the point of consumption. Planning controls within cities which have stopped cities intensifying. For example, you probably didn't know, but you didn't used to be allowed to build residential units inside Wellington City for some decades. It was just out by planning control. Minimum parking requirements, that's completely unjustified in my view. and create a subsidy for the motor car in cities and sprawl. So I think the way the Productivity Commission recommendations to push cities into a more permissive regime around greenfield development would be costly, and it would lead to sprawl, and that's problematic. Here's a diagram which shows you that as road and infrastructure costs fall, as density increases to the right. So there's, it's quite a lot of evidence. That's New Zealand evidence on that. Another area where I guess I differ from what's in the report is around the drivers on housing prices, because this is quite an important underlying debate in relation to the report. Productivity Commission view is that constraints on serviced land is the big problem. It's a supply problem, essentially. But their remedy would push infrastructure development of greenfields. I mean, there's already an NPS, a National Policy Statement on serviced property, essentially, urban development capacity, they call it, which, pushes local authorities in the direction of more provision. There's some logic to that, but it can go too far and impose significant infrastructure costs on local authorities. So I think you have to be really careful about how much cost you want to impose there. I see prices as driven by a combination of demand and supply. I'm an economist. Speculative demand on the one hand, foreign investors, people don't necessarily live here, underpinned by tax advantages of home ownership, which if you've listened to the Opportunities Party, you'll have heard that line. They're actually right in a technical sense, although their remedies I don't necessarily agree with. But those factors affect demand. And on the other side, there's supply constraints around infill development and intensification. If you've ever tried to do infill development in Wellington, for example, most of Wellington is pretty hard. And intensification tends to be constrained out by planning rules of one sort or another. Things like height and setback limits and minimum parking requirements. And I don't agree with most of those things. So I think we need to relax those sort of constraints and to get better results, allow people to build up in cities. It's not to say there shouldn't be any building out. I'm not fanatical about this, but I think allowing people to build up where actually they generally want to is really important. The last sort of series of points I want to talk about is this climate change contribution. The Productivity Commission doubts that urban planning can help cut carbon emissions at reasonable cost. So they're sceptical about that. But, in this day and age, reductions in carbon emissions are absolutely vital. They're urgent, and they may be low cost when you take into account the co-benefits. Thank you. So my view on this is you need a high and effective carbon price, but you also need to regulate in favour of cutting carbon emissions, and you need to invest in infrastructure and so on in a way that does that, push cities in that compact direction, information, education, and so on. So urban form clearly interacts with transport, and it really matters, and I'm going to show you a slide which makes this very clear. So that's the carbon emissions associated with transport, or actually not just commuting, but non-commutes as well, in central parts of Wellington, and the carbon emissions associated with more dispersed parts of Wellington. So that's I mean, how much we can do about that is a bit debatable, but we don't want to foster those expansions. Last point on this slide, I agree central government could articulate a view in an NPS, and this is a finding of the Productivity Commission on this, and that would help. So skipping over that, conclusions. Advantages of compact development are increasingly recognised, not just by planners in the market of New Zealand, but internationally. The essentially permissive approach of the Productivity Commission would undermine that trend and could foster sprawl and higher infrastructure costs, and would miss a useful and urgent opportunity to cut carbon emissions. And I'll finish with a last word from the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, a very august think tank that reported recently. and said how urban planners shape urban form and long-lived infrastructure in these coming few years will largely determine whether the world gets locked into a traditional model or moves onto a better path with more compact, connected and livable cities, greater productivity and reduced climate risk. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. And now we've got Roger, who's worked both in central and local government, so provides, and now is on governance of on both the regional council and on the hospital board. So I was very keen, having worked on the social development goals, which talk about interaction, that they were now going to give hopefully some health component to this, which is generally left out of most planning documents. Cloud intelligence. Thanks.
Kia ora mai tātou. Well, thank you. It's great to have the opportunity to talk today to such an interesting and large audience. To begin with, just to recap on the terms of reference of the Productivity Commission with their Better Urban Planning report. So the brief they were given from ministers was to do a first principles look at New Zealand's urban planning system. And then it said the purpose was is to identify the most appropriate system for allocating land use to support desirable social, economic and environmental outcomes. So if I can just start with the big picture. So I've taken this from the end of the report, where it set out 4 goals that they saw, the Productivity Commission saw in writing the report. One was around less prescriptive land use rules, more space for development within clear environmental limits, and more opportunity for local innovation. The second point was around plans need to supply development capacity to keep up with demand for housing. The third point about encouraging more use of market-based tools and infrastructure pricing. And finally, that long-term plans need to have flexibility with investment decision-making. So those are the big picture goals behind it. I think as both Sylvia and Rafe have said, I also think there are a lot of good things about the Productivity Commission's report. So let me start with the positives and the sort of things I think are good. There is a strong focus on urban planning in the treaty, for example, a national policy statement on this and a National Maori Advisory Board on planning. The second one there is a strong encouragement for use of independent hearing panels, which is what we used in Auckland on the unitary plan. It does depend, I think, on scale of the city. The whole idea around fast-growing cities need to plan for development capacity for future growth to match demand, which of course has been one of the big challenges in Auckland. The regional spatial plans should be mandatory. I was delighted when I read that, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. That councils should have more tools in their toolbox to fund infrastructure such as value uplift capture. And finally, that urban development authorities are a useful institutional arrangement, which I agree with, operating within streamlined planning processes. So this is the front cover of the Auckland plan, which is our regional spatial plan for Auckland. I think regional spatial plans are a very powerful tool, and what they do is they link the vision and strategy for the city or the city region down to the specific land use regulatory and other controls in a document like the unitary plan. And as Rafe has said, the Productivity Commission report clearly favours market-led processes over planning approaches, as Rafe says, a laissez-faire approach. I've got there a shot of the New Zealand Urban Design Protocol, and I don't think the Productivity Commission is a big fan of that, I would say. And some of the other things they said were councils overuse design rules. They talked about the current system being blind to price signals, and that leads to undersupply of housing and infrastructure. They said that urban design assessments may lead to poor exercises of regulatory discretion, and they said unnecessary and excessive and poorly targeted land use regulations have come out of it. Just before I go on and do my analysis of the report, I thought I'd just show you some examples from Wellington and Auckland of our current urban landscape. And at the end ask the question, so are we going to be better or poorer in the future in terms of our urban design as a result of what the Productivity Commission recommends? So this is some shots of Wellington. That top left-hand corner is, of course, Oriental Bay. Just so happens that my wife and I live right at the top of that picture, and I think I think it's a really nice demonstration that over the last 150 years, development has occurred that's nicely balanced the harbour and the hillside environment and the town belt. The top right-hand corner is shot of the downtown Wellington, the mix of old and new high-rise buildings, and a lot of good work has been done in Wellington, I think, encouraging apartment living in the city. The bottom left-hand corner is, of course, Cuba Street, which I think is a fabulous example of placemaking. And the bottom right-hand corner is the Civic Square, which doesn't quite work to my view. There's no active edge, and there are a few people there at the moment, but I was there this morning and there's nobody there. Auckland, I also know very well, having spent the last 5 years as the Chief Planning Officer for Auckland Council. I should acknowledge Chris Parker, who I appointed as our Chief Economist here. So Auckland, as you can see from that top left-hand view, is in a stunning physical location on the edge of a beautiful harbour and the Hauraki Gulf. You can see the high-rise downtown Auckland development there. On the top right-hand corner, the Maunga, the volcanic cones, are a very distinctive feature of the Auckland landscape and are protected, and the view shafts are protected. The bottom left-hand corner I put in there because this is an example of quite low-density housing in the inner city suburbs on the isthmus. As Rafe was saying, the Auckland plan has a very strong focus on a quality compact city. That's what the council decided early on. They wanted a quality compact city. It ran them into some conflict with the government, and it's not philosophically the same as what the Productivity Commission is saying. And we ran into some conflict there in those leafy suburbs in the isthmus there, where the local residents were not very happy about the idea of intensification. And you had full-blown NIMBYism in play. And unfortunately, on the other side of the argument, we had groups like Generation Zero forcefully advocating for a more intense and vibrant city. And on the bottom right-hand, I've put that photo in because it just illustrates what happened to Auckland and many cities in the world in the 1960s. Auckland, like Wellington, ripped up its tram tracks, started putting in big motorways. The motor car was king, and you can see the consequences of that there. And of course, only today now are we going back and to mass transit with heavy rail, with the City Rail Link, and in future with light rail. So the question, will we be better or not in the future as a result of what the Productivity Commission recommends? Excuse me. So I want to just pick out two issues which are a real concern to me in the Productivity Commission's report. And I should declare that I have an interest in the Resource Management Act because I was the Chief Executive of the Ministry for the Environment from 1986 to 1995, which covers the whole time from when we conceived the RMA to when we did all the policy and legislative development under both Right Honourable Geoffrey Palmer as Minister for the Environment and then Honourable Simon Upton right through until the passage of the Act in 1991. But that doesn't mean to say I can't be critical also of the Act. My concerns, the first one here is in the Chapter 9, which says urban planning and the national, I meant natural, urban planning and the natural environment. The recommendation says if developments breach community standards for the natural environment then decision makers should balance, that's my emphasis, just to highlight the word balance, the benefits of development against the impacts on the natural environment. Now, I disagree with that. The core idea of the Resource Management Act was that development must take place within the capacity of ecosystems that support it. So our idea was you need to have environmental bottom lines, which, if you like, surround the area of social and economic activity, and you need to ensure those bottom lines are not breached, and provided that happens, then people can be free to make their economic and social choices to enhance economic and social well-being within those environmental limits. So it's an enabling piece of legislation. It's aimed to protect environmental bottom lines, and it's not a social planning statute.
That's absolutely what we say. To do it within the capacity of ecosystems is absolutely what we say.
Well, I'll come back to that, Jeff.
I'll explain more fully later.
We're going to have a very vigorous discussion session, I can see. So while I've got the floor, 2 minutes, right, okay. So the issue is that environment and development are not competing values, one to be sacrificed to the other. And the RMA is driven by Part 2, which is the purpose to promote sustainable management of natural and physical resources. So what the NZPC seems to have done is it's gone back to use of this term balancing. That relates back to Justice Gregg in the High Court case in 1994 that I've listed there, talked about the overall judgment approach which overrode the intention of the Act to provide environmental bottom lines. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, which is a higher order court, came along and overturned that in 2014 with the King Salmon case, where Justice Terence Arnold, in a very elegant decision on that, rejected the overall judgment approach and stressed the purpose of the Act to provide environmental bottom lines. So after 24 years of jurisprudence that finally has secured a clarity in the King Salmon case, I think starting again is not sensible. And my second and last fundamental difference with the Productivity Commission is on this Chapter 13, which talks about the statutory framework, institutions and governance. And the Productivity Commission says the primary statutory base should be a single piece of legislation covering land use, planning and resource management with clear and separate objectives for regulating the built and natural environments. Now, it doesn't say so in that recommendation, but it says elsewhere in the document that they are envisaging a new Act, not reform of the current Resource Management Act. And so I don't agree with that. There's much about the RMA that needs to be fixed. I'd be the first to acknowledge that the fixes do not require throwing out the Act, nor should they involve changes to the purpose and principles of the Act, which are in sections 5, 6 and 7. I agree that the urban design provisions in the Act should be strengthened, but I'd make the point that roads and rivers and sewage schemes do not stop at the boundaries of the city, and the urban area is not an environment-free zone. So, 1 minute. I recommend that major changes are made to the way the RM Act is being implemented, and that would enable better economic and social development while also achieving environmental outcomes. And these are the sort of things that I think need to be happening. And some of these are the same things that the Productivity Commission recommends. Regional spatial planning, integration across the RMA, Local Government Act and the Transport Act, better provision for urban planning within the RMA, mitigation and adaptation of climate change, I strongly support, more central guidance through national policy statements and environmental standards, better district planning and rulemaking, and rigorous monitoring and evaluation of the effectiveness of the RM Act. That would make a huge difference. So, if I can conclude, one thing that the Productivity Commission and I agree on is that we're both fans of the writer Edward Glaeser, the Harvard economist. And I read this to you because I think it's a fantastic statement in his book, The Triumph of the City, when he said, building cities is difficult and density creates costs as well as benefits, but those costs are well worth bearing, because whether in London's ornate arcades or Rio's fractious favelas, whether in the high-rises of Hong Kong or the dusty workspaces of Dharavi, our culture, our prosperity and our freedom are all ultimately gifts of people living, working and thinking together, the ultimate triumph of the city. Thank you.